I never thought I'd be looking for a place to sleep in my car at 71 years old. The day Evan told me I had to leave, I was polishing Henry's wedding ring that I kept on the kitchen windowsill since he passed 6 months ago. 47 years of marriage, one son we'd raised with everything we had, and a lifetime of believing family meant something. All of it suddenly meant nothing. "You need to give Paige and me some space, Mum," he said, his voice steady as if he were discussing weekend plans. The house we'd renovated together with my life insurance money was now his alone. But how could a son do this to his own mother? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Evan's ultimatum, I sat in my 2008 Honda Civic in the Walmart parking lot, watching the sunrise paint the Oregon sky in shades of pink and gold. My entire life fit into 4 cardboard boxes in the backseat and trunk. 40 years of teaching 3rd grade, countless parent conferences, school plays, and potluck dinners had led to this moment, sleeping in my car because my own son decided I was inconvenient. Henry's red toolbox sat in the passenger seat beside me, its metal surface worn smooth from decades of honest work. Inside were the tools he used to fix everything from leaky faucets to broken hearts in our small town of White Pines. The weight of it felt like an anchor to the life we'd built together, the life that Evan seemed so eager to erase. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the pictures from last Christmas. There was Evan, his arm around Paige, both of them smiling broadly in front of the fireplace in what used to be my living room. I'd spent 3 days making Henry's mother's famous stuffing recipe, setting the table with the good china, and wrapping presents I couldn't really afford. 6 months later, I was homeless. The irony wasn't lost on me. When Henry died of a sudden heart attack in March, I'd sold my small life insurance policy to help Evan and Paige with their dream home renovation. The house had been a foreclosure. On Maple Street, a 1920s craftsman with good bones but terrible plumbing. Evan had insisted we put the deed in his name alone for tax purposes, he'd said. I trusted him completely. For 6 weeks, we'd work side by side, stripping wallpaper, refinishing hardwood floors, and painting every room. I'd felt useful, needed, part of something bigger than my grief. Paige would bring us sandwiches and sweet tea, and we'd sit on the front porch planning which flowers to plant in the spring. For the first time since Henry's funeral, I felt like I had a future. Now, watching early morning shoppers push their carts across the parking lot, I realized how naive I'd been. Paige's sweet tea visits had stopped the day they moved in. The guest room I'd helped design for my visits had become Paige's craft room within a week. And when I'd asked about spending Thanksgiving there, Evan had looked at me like I'd suggested something inappropriate. My phone buzzed with a text from my old friend Nora Whitcomb. Coffee later. Haven't seen you since Henry's service. I'd been avoiding everyone since Evan's ultimatum 3 days ago. Too ashamed to admit what had happened. How do you tell people that your own child threw you away like yesterday's newspaper? I typed back, rain check. Dealing with some housing stuff. It wasn't entirely a lie. Nora replied immediately, everything okay? You know, I'm here if you need anything. The kindness in those words made my chest tight. Nora had been my friend since we were 8 years old, playing hopscotch on the playground of White Pines Elementary. She'd stood beside me at Henry's funeral, holding my hand while I sobbed into a tissue that smelled like a lavender perfume. If anyone would understand, it would be Nora. But admitting what Evan had done felt like admitting I'd failed as a mother. Where had I gone wrong? I'd given him everything: piano lessons, baseball equipment, help with college tuition, my unwavering support through to failed businesses, and a brief separation from Paige 5 years ago. I'd been the mother who showed up to every game, every recital, every milestone, And this was how it ended. I pulled Henry's toolbox closer and opened it carefully. The familiar scent of WD-40 and honest work filled the small space. Beneath his socket wrenches and screwdrivers, I found the small photo he'd kept tucked in the lid. Our wedding day, 1976. I was 24, radiant in my grandmother's dress, and Henry was 26, nervous but smiling in his rented tuxedo. We'd had $37 between us and a dream of building something lasting. What would you do, Henry? I whispered to the photo, how do I make sense of this? But Henry wasn't there to answer, and the silence felt heavier than the Pacific Northwest rain that had started pattering against my windshield. I thought about the last real conversation Evan and I had before everything fell apart. It was 2 weeks after they'd moved into the house, and I'd stopped by with a homemade apple pie, his favourite since childhood. Paige had answered the door in yoga clothes, her smile tight and forced. "Oh, Lauren," she'd said, not inviting me in. Evan's in a work call. I'd stood on what used to feel like my own front porch, holding the pie like an offering. I can wait. I just wanted to see how you're settling in. We're fine, Paige had said, her tone clipped. Really busy with work and getting organised. Maybe call next time. The dismissal had stung, but I'd attributed it to stress. Moving was hard, I told myself. They needed time to adjust. I'd driven home to my small apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, where I'd been staying temporarily while they got settled, and convinced myself that things would improve. They hadn't. If anything, the distance had grown wider with each passing day. Evan's phone calls became shorter, his visits non-existent. When I'd asked about the family barbecue they'd mentioned planning, Evan had said, "Maybe next year, Mom, we're still figuring things out." Now I understood what they'd been figuring out. How to cut me out of their lives entirely. The Walmart parking lot was filling up with the usual mix of early shoppers and people like me who had nowhere else to go. I recognized the tired faces of those who'd spent the night in their vehicles, the careful way they folded their blankets and organized their few possessions. I was part of an invisible community I'd never noticed before. My stomach growled, reminding me that I'd been too upset to eat dinner the night before. I had $43 in my wallet and $17 in my checking account. My Social Security wouldn't come for another 2 weeks, and even then, it barely covered basic expenses. Evan knew all of this when he asked me to leave. I gathered the courage to walk into Walmart, avoiding eye contact with other customers as I selected a small loaf of bread, peanut butter, and a bottle of water. The teenage cashier didn't look up as she scanned my items, and I was grateful for her indifference. Back in my car, I made a peanut butter sandwich and tried to plan my next move. The homeless shelter was an option, but the thought of admitting that level of defeat made my chest tighten. I taught some of those kids who might be working there now. How could I face them? My phone rang, Evan's ringtone. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he'd realized his mistake. Maybe he was calling to apologize and invite me home. "Mum, I wanted to check in." His voice was carefully neutral. "Are you getting settled okay?" "Settled where, Evan?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "In my car." There was a pause. "I thought you'd figured something out by now. Maybe gotten a small apartment or something. With what money? You know I gave you everything to help with the house. That was your choice, Mum, and I appreciate it. I really do. But Paige and I need our space right now. We're working on our marriage, and having you there was creating tension." The casualness of his betrayal took my breath away, creating tension. "I helped you build that home, Evan. I sanded floors until my hands bled. I painted every room while you were at work. How is that creating tension? You were always there, Mom, always hovering, always commenting on how we did things." Paige felt like she couldn't relax in her own home. I was helping, I said, my voice breaking. I thought I was part of the family. You are part of the family. Just not that part. Look, I have to go. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, replaying his words. You always do. As if surviving his abandonment was just another problem for me to solve. Like helping with his homework or driving him to practice when he was young. I thought about calling him back, demanding a real explanation, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. Evan had made his choice, and I was the cost of his new life with Paige. The rain picked up, drumming against my roof like fingers tapping impatiently. I watched other people hurry across the parking lot, heading to jobs and lives that made sense. While I sat in my car eating peanut butter sandwiches and wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, Henry's wedding ring caught the grey light filtering through my windshield. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. He'd worn it for 37 years, through every challenge we'd faced together. Now it was just another reminder of what I'd lost, but as I held it, I remembered something Henry used to say when we face difficult times. Lorraine, sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what you're really made of. At the time, it had seemed like one of his philosophical observations that I'd smile at and forget. Now, sitting alone in a Walmart parking lot at 71, I wondered if I was about to find out what I was really made of. The rain kept falling, and I kept sitting there, holding my husband's ring and trying to figure out how to start over when most people my age were thinking about endings. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I was done depending on Evan for anything. It was time to remember who I was before I became his mother, before I became his victim. But first, I needed to find a place to sleep tonight. The White Pines Community Center smelled like industrial coffee and disinfectant, but it felt like sanctuary compared to my car. I'd finally swallowed my pride and called Nora 3 days after my conversation with Evan, when the reality of sleeping in Walmart parking lots had worn down my resistance. She'd picked me up without questions, though I could see the concern in her eyes when she saw the boxes in my back seat. You can use the shower in the community center, Nora had said simply. And we need to talk. Now, sitting in her small office, overlooking the gymnasium where local kids played pickup basketball, I felt the weight of my situation settling around me like a heavy coat. Nora poured coffee from her ancient percolator and set a steaming mug in front of me, along with a manila folder I hadn't noticed before. Lorraine, she said, settling into the chair across from me, how long were you planning to live in your car before you told me what was really going on? I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to hold on to. I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that your own son threw you out? Nora's expression darkened. He what? The story came tumbling out. Henry's death, the house renovation, the deed in Evan's name, and the casual cruelty of his dismissal. With each detail, Nora's face grew more thunderous. By the time I finished, she was gripping her coffee mug, so tightly her knuckles were white. That little bastard, she said finally. I remember when he was 8 and cried for an hour because he accidentally stepped on a ladybug. What happened to that boy? I've been asking myself the same question, I said. Maybe I spoiled him. Maybe I made him think the world owed him something. Stop it, Nora said sharply. You gave that boy everything, including parents who loved him unconditionally. His choices aren't your fault. She pushed the manila folder toward me. Besides, I think you might have more options than you realize. I opened the folder and found myself looking at a stack of legal documents bearing my father's name, Walter M. Franklin. The papers were old, yellowed at the edges, and covered in legal language that made my head spin. Where did you get these? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My late husband's law office, Nora said. Remember, Jim handled estate planning for half the county. When he died 5 years ago, I helped sort through his files. I found these. In a sealed envelope marked Franklin Trust, Lauren Maddox. They were supposed to be delivered to you, but only if you initiated contact about your father's estate. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. My father's name appeared repeatedly, along with legal terms like irrevocable trust and beneficiary. The date on the documents was from 1998, 7 years after my father's death, and 3 years after I'd stopped wondering if he'd left me anything at all. I don't understand, I said. My father disowned me when I married Henry. He said I was throwing my life away on a mechanic with no prospects. We didn't speak for the last 10 years of his life. Nora pointed to a highlighted section on the 3rd page. According to this, your father established a trust fund worth approximately $150,000 in 1991, shortly before he died. The funds were invested conservatively and have been growing ever since. Jim's notes indicate the current value is somewhere around $400,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $400,000. Well, I'd been struggling to make ends meet on a teacher's salary, while Henry and I had worried about every major repair and saved for months to afford a vacation. Well, I'd sold my life insurance policy to help. Even with his house, I'd had hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a trust fund I knew nothing about. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked, my voice rising. Why was this kept secret? Nora flipped to another page. Your father's instructions were very specific. The trust could only be activated if you came forward asking about his estate. He wanted to make sure you actually wanted a relationship with his memory before you gained access to his money. I laughed a bit early. A relationship with his memory. He spent my entire childhood telling me I wasn't good enough, smart enough, pretty enough. When I brought Henry home to meet him, he asked if I was pregnant because why else would I settle for someone like that? Your father was a complicated man, Nora said gently. But according to these documents, he regretted the estrangement. There's a letter here, sealed, that was supposed to be given to you along with the trust documents. She handed me a cream-coloured envelope with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. I'd seen that writing on birthday cards that came with lectures about my poor choices, on Christmas presents that came with strings attached. On the final letter, he'd set me after Henry, and I married, telling me not to expect any inheritance. Since I'd chosen my path, with shaking fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. My dear Lauren, it began, if you are reading this, then perhaps there is hope for forgiveness between us, even in death. I know I was a difficult father, too proud and too stubborn to admit when I was wrong. Your marriage to Henry has proven me wrong in every way. I have watched from a distance as you built a life of meaning and love, while I remained alone with my pride and regrets. This trust is my attempt to give you the security I should have provided while I lived. It is not an apology. Words are too small for that. But perhaps it is a beginning. Use it wisely, as I know you will. Your mother would be proud of the woman you became, even if I was too foolish to say so. Well, I could. I hope someday you can forgive a stubborn old man who loved you more than he knew how to show. Your father, Walter M. Franklin. I read the letter twice before the words truly sank in. My father, who had spent my childhood criticizing every choice I made, who had disowned me for marrying beneath my station, who had died without speaking to me for 10 years, had been watching my life from afar. He'd seen what I'd made of myself. Despite his disapproval, and somewhere in his cold heart, he'd found pride. $400,000, I said aloud, testing the words. It felt surreal, like winning a lottery I'd never entered. Nora was watching me carefully. According to the law firm handling the trust, all you have to do is provide proof of identity and sign the appropriate documents. The money has been yours all along. You just didn't know it. I thought about Evan, probably having dinner with Paige in the dining room we'd painted together, discussing their plans for a life that didn't include me. He'd counted on my helplessness, my dependence on his charity. He'd never imagined that I might have resources he didn't know about. There's something else, Nora said, pulling out another document. The trust includes a provision for real estate investments. Your father apparently owned several properties around the county that were sold after his death, but the proceeds were held in trust. According to this, you have the option to purchase property directly from the trust funds without tax penalties. I stared at the papers spread across Nora's desk, feeling like I was looking at a map to a country I'd never known existed. All these years, I thought my father's final act of cruelty was cutting me out of his will entirely. Instead, he'd created a safety net I'd never known existed, one that could change everything. I need to call the law firm, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in days. I need to understand exactly what this means. Nora smiled for the first time since I'd told her about Evan. I already took the liberty of making an appointment. Tomorrow morning at 10, you'll meet with Aidan Fitz. He's young, but thorough, and he specializes in trust law. I looked down at my father's letter again, studying his careful handwriting. Despite everything between us, he'd found a way to take care of me after death in a way he'd never managed while alive. The irony was bitter and sweet at the same time. Nora, I said slowly, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest with me. Always. Do you think I'm a fool for what I did for Evan? For giving him everything and trusting him completely. Nora was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee while she considered her words. I think you're a mother who loved her child. Unconditionally, that's not foolish, it's human. But Lorraine, there's a difference between loving someone and letting them destroy you. Evan made his choice when he decided your sacrifice wasn't worth your place in his life. I keep thinking, I should call him, tell him about the trust. Maybe if he knew I wasn't going to be a financial burden. No, Nora said firmly. That money is yours, not his. And more importantly, what he did to you wasn't about money. It was about control, about embarrassment, about him deciding you didn't fit into the life he wanted to build. Money won't change that. She was right, and I know it. Evan's rejection hadn't been about my financial situation. It had been about his perception that I didn't belong in his new life. My teacher's pension, my modest clothes, my old car, my small-town values, all of it embarrassed him. He wanted a mother who matched his upwardly mobile lifestyle, not the woman who'd actually raised him. So, what do I do now? I asked. Nora grinned, and for a moment I saw the mischievous 8-year-old I'd known all those years ago. Now, my dear friend, you take your inheritance and you build yourself a life that's yours alone. And if Evan doesn't like it, that's his problem to solve. I folded my father's letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Outside Nora's office window, the basketball game was wrapping up. Teenagers laughing and calling out to each other as they gathered their belongings. Their voices echoed in the gymnasium, full of possibility and future plans. For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest. I wasn't the helpless old woman Evan thought he'd discarded. I was Walter Franklin's daughter, and apparently, he'd made sure I'd never be truly helpless. Even when the people who should have protected me failed. Tomorrow, I would meet with the lawyer and learn exactly what my options were. Tonight, I would sleep in a real bed at Nora's house, eat a home-cooked meal, and start planning a future that belonged entirely to me. Evan had wanted space. He was about to get more than he'd bargained for. The law office of Patterson, Mills and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that had been standing since White Pines was a logging town. As I climbed the narrow stairs, my legs shaky from 3 weeks of sleeping poorly and eating irregularly, I clutched the manila folder containing my father's documents like a lifeline. Aiden Fitz looked younger than my grandson would have if Evan had ever given me one. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and earnest brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office was cramped but organized. Law books stacked neatly on shelves that reached the ceiling, and a coffee mug that read World, okayest lawyer sitting next to his computer. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, standing to shake my hand. His grip was firm, respectful. "I'm sorry for your loss." Both recent and past, Nora had clearly filled him in on my situation. I appreciated that he didn't make me explain how I'd ended up sleeping in my car. "Please, call me Lauren," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "And thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I've been handling your father's trust for the past 2 years, ever since I joined the firm," he said, opening a thick file. "I'll be honest, I wondered if we'd ever hear from you. The original instructions were very specific about waiting for you to make contact. I had no idea the trust existed," I admitted. "My father and I were estranged when he died. I assumed he'd left everything to charity or distant relatives." Aiden nodded, flipping through the documents. "That's actually quite common in cases like this. Parents who want to provide for their children, but also want to ensure the inheritance isn't taken for granted." He looked up at me. "Your father was quite specific in his instructions. He wanted to make sure you actively chose to reconnect with his memory, and now that I have. Now you have access to one of the most well-managed trust funds I've ever seen," Aiden said, pulling out a thick financial statement. "Your father was apparently more astute with investments than he was with relationships. The original $150,000 has grown to $423,000 over the past 32 years. The number still felt surreal. I thought about all the times Henry and I had worried about money when the furnace died and we'd had to choose between heat and groceries. For a week, when Evan needed emergency dental work, and we'd borrowed against Henry's truck, when I'd wanted to take a sabbatical to care for my mother during her final illness, but couldn't afford the unpaid leave. "What are the restrictions?" I asked. "There have to be strings attached." Aiden smiled, surprisingly few. "Your father set up what's called a discretionary trust, which means you have broad authority over how the funds are used. The only restrictions are that you can't give more than $50,000 to any individual in a single year, and you can't use the funds for anything illegal." The real estate provision that Nora mentioned. "Ah, yes." Aiden pulled out another set of documents. "This is where it gets interesting. Your father owned several rental properties around the county that were sold after his death. However, he structured the trust so that you could purchase real estate directly through the trust, which provides significant tax advantages. Essentially, you could buy a home and the trust would own it, but you'd have lifetime occupancy rights." My mind was spinning. Not only could I afford to rent an apartment, I could actually buy a house. After 3 weeks of homelessness, the concept felt impossible. How quickly could something like that happen? I asked. "Real estate purchases. Assuming we find the right property and there are no complications, we could close within 30 days. Aiden leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Maddox, Lauren, may I ask what your immediate housing situation is? I know this process can feel overwhelming when you're dealing with uncertainty." The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. "I've been staying with a friend, but I can't impose on her hospitality much longer. Before that, I was sleeping in my car." Aiden's expression darkened. "Nora mentioned there were family complications. I'm sorry you've had to go through that. My son asked me to leave the house I'd helped him renovate. The house that was purchased with my life insurance money, but deeded in his name." The bitterness in my voice surprised me. "Is there any legal recourse for recovering those funds?" I shook my head. "I gave the money willingly, and I trusted him to do what was right. That was my mistake. Trust isn't a mistake, Lauren. Betraying trust is." Aiden made a note on his legal pad. Would you like me to look into your options regarding the house? Even if the deed is in your son's name, if you can prove you provided the funds for purchase and improvement, there might be grounds for a claim. The idea of taking legal action against Evan made my stomach clench. I don't know, maybe. Right now, I just want to focus on moving forward. Of course. Let me ask you this. What would your ideal living situation look like? If money weren't an issue, where would you want to be? I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a life beyond survival mode. Somewhere quiet but not isolated. A garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. Maybe a small workshop where I could refinish furniture. I used to enjoy that before. I trailed off, realizing I couldn't remember when I'd stopped doing things I enjoyed. Before you devoted yourself entirely to taking care of everyone else, Aiden said gently, something like that. He pulled out a laptop and started typing. Let me show you a few properties that are currently on the market. We can look at them as possibilities, no commitment. The first house he showed me was a small ranch on the outskirts of town, with a large yard and an attached garage that could serve as a workshop. The second was a cottage near the river with an established garden and fruit trees. The third made my breath catch, a restored 1930s bungalow on Pine Street, just 6 blocks from the elementary school where I taught for 40 years. That one, I said immediately. Can we see that one? Aiden grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. It's been on the market for 3 months, which means the seller might be motivated to negotiate. And it's been completely updated. New plumbing, electrical, roof, everything. You'd basically be buying a new house in a vintage package. How much? $285,000, well within your budget, and it would leave you with significant funds for furnishing, maintenance, and living expenses. I stared at the photos on his laptop screen. The house had a front porch with white columns, hardwood floors, and a kitchen with windows that looked out onto a backyard full of mature trees. It looked like the kind of home I'd dreamed about when Henry and I were young and saving every penny. There's something else, Aiden said, pulling out another document. Your father included a provision for monthly distributions from the trust. Essentially, you'd receive $2,000 per month for living expenses, in addition to your Social Security and pension. You'd never have to worry about money again. $2,000 a month. More than I'd ever made teaching, even in my final years. Combined with my modest teacher's pension and Social Security, it would give me a comfortable middle-class lifestyle for the rest of my life. This doesn't feel real, I admitted. 3 weeks ago, I was rationing peanut butter sandwiches. Now you're telling me I can buy a house and live comfortably. It's real, Aiden assured me. And Lauren, if you don't mind me saying so, you deserve this. You've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people. It's time someone took care of you. I thought about Evan, probably having lunch with Paige at some trendy restaurant, discussing their week and plans without a thought for where his mother was sleeping. He'd calculated that I had no options, no resources, no power to change my situation. He'd been wrong about all of it. I want to see the house, I said. When can we arrange that? I can call the listing agent right now and set something up for this afternoon if you'd like. Yes, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Yes, let's do that. As Aiden made the phone call, I looked out his office window at the main street of White Pines. This was the town where I'd been born, where I'd gone to school, where I'd taught for 4 decades. It was where Henry and I had built our life together, where we'd raised Evan with love and hope and dreams for his future. Evan had outgrown this place, or thought he had. He'd moved to Portland for college and stayed there, coming back only for obligatory visits that became shorter and less frequent over the years. He'd made it clear that White Pines represented everything he wanted to leave behind. But White Pines, was my home. It was where people remembered my 40 years of teaching, where former students still stopped me in the grocery store to tell me about their children or their careers. It was where Nora and I had shared a lifetime of friendship, where Henry's memory lived in every familiar corner. If Evan didn't want me in his new life, then I would build a life of my own in the place that had always been mine. I would buy a house with my father's money and fill it with things that brought me joy. I would plant a garden and refinish furniture, and maybe even get a dog, something I'd always wanted. But Henry had been allergic too, for the first time since Henry's death. I felt excitement stirring in my chest instead of grief or fear. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. Aiden hung up the phone. Good news. The agent can meet us at the house at 2 o'clock today. Are you ready to go house hunting, Lauren? I thought about my few possessions still packed in boxes in Nora's spare room, about the wedding ring I carried in my purse like a talisman, about my father's letter apologizing for a lifetime of missed opportunities. Yes, I said, I'm ready. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The house on Pine Street was even more beautiful in person than in the photos. Standing on the front porch, while the real estate agent fumbled with the lockbox, I could picture myself sitting there in the evenings, watching the neighborhood children play in their yards, tending to flower boxes full of petunias and marigolds. Built in 1934, the agent, a cheerful woman named Sarah, was saying as she opened the front door. The current owners bought it as a foreclosure 5 years ago and put about $80,000 into renovations. Everything's been updated to current code. I stepped inside and immediately felt something settle in my chest. The hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and the living room had the kind of built-in bookshelves I'd always dreamed of filling with novels and photo albums. The fireplace was original brick, restored but still carrying the character of 8 decades of life. The kitchen's been completely redone, Sarah said, leading us through an archway. Granite countertops, stainless appliances, but they kept the original cabinetry and just refinished it. I ran my hand along the smooth wood of the cabinets, imagining myself cooking Sunday dinners in this bright, airy space. The windows looked out onto a backyard that was larger than it had appeared in the photos, with fruit trees and raised garden beds that someone had loved and tended, who lived here before. I asked. An elderly couple, the Hendersons. They were the original owners, bought it new in 1934 and lived here for 60 years. After they passed, their children sold it to investors who flipped it. The current owners intended to live here but got transferred for work. 60 years in the same house. I thought about the Hendersons growing old together in these rooms, celebrating anniversaries and holidays, maybe raising children who brought grandchildren to visit. There was something appealing about the continuity, the idea of creating a lasting home in a place that had already sheltered a lifetime of love. Aiden was taking notes as we walked through the 3 bedrooms and single bathroom. The master bedroom was modest but comfortable, with windows facing the garden. The second bedroom was perfect for a guest room, though I wondered who I would invite to stay. The third was smaller, ideal for the craft room. I'd never had space for in any of the apartments and small houses Henry and I had shared. The basement's been finished as a workshop area, Sarah said, leading us downstairs. The previous owners were into woodworking. The basement workshop was perfect, well lit, with fluorescent fixtures, plenty of electrical outlets, and built-in cabinets for storage. I could see myself down here refinishing furniture, maybe even building simple pieces from scratch. Henry had tried to teach me woodworking, but our garage had been too small and too cluttered for serious projects. What do you think? Aiden asked. As we returned to the living room, I think it feels like home, I said honestly. But that might just be because I've been sleeping in my car for 3 weeks. Sarah laughed. Trust me, when you know, you know. I've been selling houses for 15 years, and there's something special about the properties that are meant for specific people. What would it take to make an offer? I asked, surprising myself with my directness. With your financial situation, we could make a cash offer, Aiden said. That would give us significant negotiating power. Properties in this price range don't usually attract cash buyers. We spent another hour going through the details, inspection timelines, closing procedures, the logistics of transferring money from the trust. My head was spinning with legal terminology and financial calculations, but beneath the confusion was a growing sense of certainty. This house felt right in a way that nothing had felt right since Henry died. As we prepared to leave, I walked through the rooms one more time, trying to imagine my furniture arranged in these spaces. Most of what Henry and I had owned was either modest or sentimental, nothing that would look out of place in a 1930s bungalow. I could keep Henry's recliner by the fireplace, put my grandmother's china cabinet in the dining room, hang the wedding photos in the hallway. I want to make an offer, I told Aiden as we stood on the front porch. I want to offer the full asking price. Both Aiden and Sarah looked surprised. Lorraine, we can probably negotiate down from the asking price, Aiden said. The house has been on the market for 3 months. I don't want to play games, I said. I want them to accept the offer quickly so I can move in. I've been homeless for 3 weeks. I'm ready to be done with uncertainty. Sarah was already pulling out her phone. I'll call the listing agent right now and present the offer. With a cash sale at full price, I expect they'll accept immediately. While Sarah made her phone calls, Aiden and I sat on the front porch steps. The late afternoon sun was filtering through the maple trees that lined Pine Street, and the neighborhood was coming alive with the sounds of children getting home from school and parents starting dinner preparations. This is a good decision, Aiden said. And Lorraine, I want you to know that buying this house doesn't mean you can't pursue other options with regard to your son. If you want to explore recovering the money you invested in his house, No. I said firmly, I've been thinking about it, and I don't want to fight Evan in court. I want him to understand what he's lost, but I want him to realize it on his own. What do you mean? I thought about my father's letter, about his regret at pushing me away and watching my life from a distance. Evan made a choice when he asked me to leave. He chose to prioritize his marriage and his embarrassment over his relationship with me. I can't force him to change his mind, but I can show him what he's given up. By living well, Aiden said, understanding, by living well, and living independently. Evan counted on me being helpless, being grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to give me. When he sees that I don't need him, that I'm not the burden he thought I was, maybe he'll realize what he's lost. Sarah finished her phone call and walked back to where we were sitting, her face bright with excitement. They accepted, full price, cash offer. They want to close in 3 weeks. Congratulations, Lorraine, you just bought yourself a house. The reality of it hit me like a wave. I owned a house. After 71 years of life, 47 years of marriage, and 3 weeks of homelessness, I was finally going to be a homeowner. Not a co-owner, not a dependent living in someone else's space, but the sole owner of a piece of property that belonged entirely to me. I need to call Nora, I said, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. She answered on the first ring. How did it go? I bought a house, I said, and started crying. Oh, honey, Nora's voice was warm with joy and relief. Tell me everything. I described the house, the offer, the closing timeline, while Sarah and Aiden discreetly gave me space to process my emotions. When I finally hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months. Nora wants to take me furniture shopping, I told Aiden. She says we need to celebrate. You should celebrate, he said. This is a big day. And Lauren, I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone. I'll handle all the legal aspects of the purchase, and if you need help with anything else, setting up utilities, finding contractors, whatever, just call. I looked at this young man who had shown me more kindness in one afternoon than my own son had shown me in months. Why are you being so nice to me? You barely know me. Aiden was quiet for a moment. My grandmother raised me after my parents died. She was the strongest woman I've ever known, but she spent her whole life taking care of everyone else. When she got older, my uncles decided she was too much trouble and put her in a nursing home against her wishes. She died within 6 months, and I've always regretted not fighting harder for her. He looked at me directly. I guess I see something of her in you. I'm sorry, I said softly. Don't be sorry. Just don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve good things. You've earned this house, this independence, this chance to live life on your own terms. As we walked back to Aiden's car, I found myself already planning changes to the house. I would replace the curtains in the living room with something lighter, maybe plant herbs in the kitchen window, set up the third bedroom as a craft space, where I could work on projects that brought me joy instead of just function. For 47 years, every decision had been made jointly with Henry, every plan shaped by what was best for our family, every dream tempered by practical considerations and budget constraints. Even after Henry died, I'd continued to define myself in relation to other people, as Evan's mother, as a grieving widow, as someone whose purpose was taking care of others. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based solely on what I wanted, what would make me happy, what would create the life I wanted to live. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart jumped, hoping it might be Evan, but it was just a spam message about car warranties. I realized I'd been unconsciously hoping he would call, that somehow he would sense that things were changing in my life and want to be part of it. But that was the old Lauren thinking, the woman who had spent decades prioritizing everyone else's needs above her own. The new Lauren, the homeowner, the woman with financial independence and options, didn't need Evan's approval or attention. She could build a life that was full and meaningful with or without him. It would take time to fully embrace that change. I knew 71 years of putting others first wasn't going to be undone in an afternoon. But sitting in Aiden's car, watching my new neighborhood pass by the windows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for my own future. In 3 weeks, I would have keys to my own front door. I would wake up in my own bedroom, make coffee in my own kitchen, and sit on my own front porch watching the world go by. After months of uncertainty and weeks of homelessness, I was going to be home. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Oregon famous. All golden light and maple leaves drifting like confetti. Nora had recruited half the community centre's volunteers to help me move my modest belongings from her house to Pine Street. And I stood on my new front porch, holding my house keys and feeling like I was in someone else's dream. Stop looking. So shocked, Nora said, carrying a box labeled kitchen, fragile up the front steps. You live here now. Act like it. The truth was, I still couldn't quite believe it. 3 weeks had passed since I'd made the offer, 3 weeks of paperwork and inspections and planning, but actually standing inside my own house felt surreal. The afternoon light streaming through the living room windows illuminated hardwood floors that belonged to me, walls that I could paint any color I wanted, space that was entirely mine to fill or leave empty as I chose. My phone had been silent for the entire 3 weeks. Part of me had expected Evan to call, maybe sensing through some parental intuition that major changes were happening in my life. But there had been nothing. No calls, no texts, no curiosity about where I was living or how I was managing his. Silence was its own kind of communication. I was arranging Henry's tools in the basement workshop when I heard voices upstairs. Nora was talking to someone I didn't recognize, their conversation carrying down through the heating vents with the casual intimacy of old friends. Never seen her this excited about anything in years, Nora was saying. It's like watching someone come back to life. Good for her, a male voice replied. This house has been empty too long. The Hendersons would have loved knowing it was going to someone who'd appreciate it. I climbed the stairs to find Nora chatting with a man in his 60s, wearing coveralls and carrying a toolbox that looked like it had seen decades of honest work. He had kind eyes and calloused hands, and something about him reminded me immediately of Henry. Lauren, this is Bob Chen, Nora said. He owns the hardware store downtown, and he knew the Hendersons when they lived here. Mrs. Chen's husband. I asked, remembering the flower shop where I'd briefly rented the upstairs apartment. That's right. Emmy, I mentioned you stayed with us. For a while, he looked around the living room approvingly. This place looks good. The flippers who renovated it did decent work, but it needs someone who'll really live in it, you know. Houses can tell when they're just investments. It already feels like home, I said, and meant it. The Hendersons would be pleased, Bob said. They lived here for 60 years, raised for kids in this house. Martha had the most beautiful garden you've ever seen. Tomatoes, beans, flowers everywhere. If you're planning to garden, I can show you where she had her best luck. I'd love that, I said. I've always wanted to grow my own vegetables. Bob spent the next hour walking me through the house, pointing out quirks and features that only someone who'd known it for decades would notice. The basement workshop had been Frank Henderson's pride and joy, where he'd built furniture and toys for his grandchildren. The guest bedroom had been added in the 1950s when Martha's mother came to live with them. The fruit trees in the backyard had been planted to commemorate each child's birth. It's a house with a lot of love in it, Bob said as we finished the tour. That's probably why it feels so comfortable. As evening approached and the volunteers finished helping me unpack, I found myself alone in my house for the first time. The silence was different from the hollow quiet of Nora's guest room or the anxious stillness of sleeping in my car. This silence belonged to me. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and grilled cheese, the kind of meal Henry and I used to share when we were young and money was tight. But instead of eating at the small dinette said I'd bought second-hand, I took my plate to the living room and sat in Henry's old recliner, positioned now where I could look out at the street through the large front windows. The neighborhood was settling into evening routines. Porch lights were coming on, children were being called in for dinner, and the smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace drifted through my slightly open window. It felt like belonging, like being part of something larger than myself. My phone rang, startling me out of my reverie. For a moment, my heart jumped with the possibility that it might be Evan, that he had somehow sensed I needed to hear from him on this significant day. But the caller ID showed Aiden's number. Lauren, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to check and see how your first day in the house went. It's perfect, I said, surprised by the contentment in my own voice. I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful. I'm glad, and I have some news that might interest you. I've been researching the situation with your son's house, the one you helped finance. You mentioned the property is on Maple Street. Yes, why? I drove by it this afternoon, and there's a for sale sign in the yard. A big one, with price reduced banner. I set down my soup spoon, processing this information. They're selling the house. It appears so. The listing went active 3 days ago. Initial asking price was $380,000, now reduced to $365,000, $365,000. For the house, I'd help renovate with my own hands and my life insurance money. The house Evan had claimed was their dream home, the place where they were supposed to build their future together. Do you know why they're selling? I asked. I have a contact at the real estate agency handling the listing. Apparently, your son and his wife are getting divorced. She filed papers 2 weeks ago. The news hit me like a physical blow. Evan and Paige were divorcing. The marriage he'd claimed I was threatening, the relationship he'd prioritized over his connection to me, was over. He'd destroyed our relationship to protect something that was already falling apart. Are you okay? Aiden asked. I know this must be difficult news. I don't know what I feel, I said honestly, sad, I think, and angry. And maybe a little vindicated, which makes me feel guilty. Those are all normal reactions. Lauren, there's something else, given that they're selling the house and divorcing, and given that you provided significant financial contribution to the purchase and renovation, you might have grounds to recover some of your investment. You think I should sue him? I think you should consider your options. $50,000 is a substantial amount of money, even with your current financial security. And more importantly, what your son did to you was wrong. There should be consequences for that kind of betrayal. I looked around my living room, at the comfortable furniture I'd chosen myself, at the walls I could paint any color I wanted, at the life I was building entirely on my own terms. Let me think about it. After I hung up, I sat in Henry's chair. As darkness settled over Pine Street, somewhere across town, Evan was probably packing boxes, dividing up the possessions he'd accumulated during a marriage that had lasted less time than I'd been homeless. The house we'd renovated together would soon belong to strangers who had no idea about the sweat and hope and sacrifice that had gone into making it beautiful. Part of me felt vindicated. Evan had been so certain that I was the problem that removing me from his life would solve his marital difficulties. Now it was clear that the issues in his marriage had nothing to do with my presence and everything to do with problems between him and Paige that existed long before I'd moved in. But mostly, I felt sad. Sad for the years of connection we'd lost. Sad for the grandchildren I might never have. Sad for the family bond that had been broken over his misguided priorities. Evan had chosen to see me as an obstacle to his happiness instead of recognizing that I was one of the few people who would always love him unconditionally. I thought about calling him, offering comfort and support during what was surely a difficult time. The mother in me wanted to reach out, to be the person he could lean on when his carefully constructed life fell apart. But I'd spent too many years being available for comfort, while being dismissed when convenience suited him. Instead, I walked through my house, turning on lights and admiring the spaces I was slowly making my own. Tomorrow, I would plant bulbs in the front flower beds for spring blooms. This weekend, I would visit the farmer's market and buy ingredients for the kind of elaborate cooking I'd never had time for when I was working. Next month, I would invite Nora and some of the other community center volunteers for Thanksgiving dinner in my own dining room. I was building a life that didn't revolve around other people's needs and approval. For the first time since Henry died, I was looking forward instead of looking back. Evan's divorce was his crisis to navigate, his mistake to process, his future to rebuild. I had my own future to focus on now, and it was looking brighter every day. Winter in my own house felt like a revelation. I'd lived through dozens of Oregon winters, but this was different. The luxury of adjusting the thermostat without consulting anyone, of making hot chocolate at midnight without worrying about waking someone, of reading by the fireplace in Henry's old recliner while snow dusted the fruit trees outside my window. It had been 4 months since I'd moved to Pine Street, and I was finally starting to feel like the woman I might have been if I'd never defined myself solely through taking care of others. I joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the elementary school where I taught for 40 years, and even begun taking watercolor painting classes at the community center. For the first time in decades, my days belonged entirely to me. That's why Evan's unexpected phone call on a February morning felt like an intrusion from a life I'd left behind. Mom? His voice was tentative, almost uncertain. It's Evan. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. After 6 months of silence, hearing his voice in my peaceful kitchen felt surreal. Hello, Evan. I wasn't sure if this was still your number. I heard you moved. I did. I didn't offer any additional information. Let him ask if he wanted to know more. Look, I know it's been a while since we talked, and I know things were difficult the last time we saw each other. I was wondering if we could meet somewhere. Maybe have coffee and catch up. The careful neutrality of his tone told me this wasn't a social call. After months of silence, Evan wanted something from me. The old Lorraine would have immediately agreed, grateful for any scrap of attention from her son. The new Lorraine was more cautious. What did you want to talk about? There was a pause. It's complicated. Things have changed in my life, and I've been doing some thinking about family, about what's important. I'd rather discuss it in person. Are you talking about the divorce? Another pause, longer this time. You know about that. Word travels in a small town, Evan, especially when the house that someone helped renovate with their life insurance money goes up for sale. Mom, about that house, about everything that happened to coffee sounds fine. I interrupted. I wasn't ready for his apologies over the phone, if that's what he was building toward. When and where? Tomorrow afternoon. That little cafe on Main Street, around 2. I'll be there. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process the conversation. 6 months ago, this phone call would have set me into an emotional tailspin of hope and anxiety. Now, I felt curious but detached, like an observer watching someone else's family drama unfold. I called Nora, who was predictably skeptical about Evan's sudden desire to reconnect. He wants something from you, she said bluntly. Men like that don't develop consciences overnight. They develop needs, maybe, I said. But I'm not the same person, he discarded. Whatever he wants, he's going to discover that I don't need his approval anymore. Just remember that, Nora said. You've built a good life without him. Don't let him manipulate you into feeling guilty about that. The next afternoon, I dressed carefully for my coffee date with Evan, not to impress him, but to remind myself of who I'd become. I wore the burgundy sweater I'd bought for my book club meetings, paired with the pearl earrings Henry had given me for our 20th anniversary. I looked like a woman who belonged somewhere, who had purpose and dignity and options. Evan was already waiting when I arrived at the cafe, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The past 6 months had aged him. He looked tired, thinner, and there was something defeated in his posture that I'd never seen before. When he looked up and saw me, his expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, guilt, and something that might have been relief. Mom, he said, standing awkwardly, you look ... good, really good, thank you. I settled into the chair across from him, noting how he seemed to be studying my clothes, my demeanor, looking for signs of the broken woman he'd expected to find. We ordered coffee and made stilted small talk about the weather, the changes to downtown White Pines, anything except the elephant in the room. Finally, Evan took a deep breath and looked directly at me. I owe you an apology, he said. For what happened last summer, for asking you to leave, for the way I handled everything after Dad died. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. The apology felt rehearsed, but the emotion behind it seemed genuine. What changed your mind? Evan was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Paige left me 3 months ago. Filed for divorce, moved back to Seattle, took half of everything. When I was packing up the house, going through all the work we'd done on it, I kept thinking about you helping with the renovation, about how excited you were to be part of it, and I realized I'd thrown away the one person who actually cared about me for someone who was just waiting for a better opportunity to come along. His voice cracked slightly. Paige told me during one of our final fights that she'd never really liked having you around, that she'd been pushing me to get rid of you from the beginning. She said you made her feel judged. I absorbed this information. Without surprise, I'd sensed Paige's discomfort, her subtle ways of excluding me from conversations and plans. What surprised me was that Evan was finally acknowledging it. So you're apologizing because your marriage failed? I'm apologizing because I chose the wrong side, Evan said. I prioritized someone who didn't really love me over the person who'd loved me unconditionally my entire life, had loved you unconditionally, I corrected gently. Past tense. Evan's face crumpled slightly. Mum, please. I know I hurt you. I know I was selfish and cruel. But we're family. That has to count for something. I sipped my coffee, studying my son's face. 6 months ago, those words would have melted my resolve completely. The promise of reconciliation, of getting my son back, would have made me willing to forgive anything. Now, I feel compassionate, but detached, like a teacher watching a student finally understand a lesson that had taken too long to learn. Family is more than biology, Evan, I said. It's choice, it's showing up. It's putting other people's welfare before your own convenience. You chose not to be family when you decided I was disposable, but I'm choosing now, he said urgently. I'm here, I'm apologizing, I want to make things right between us. What does that look like to you? Making things right. Evan hesitated, and I could see him calculating his words. I know you've been staying with Nora, and I know that's not a permanent solution. I thought maybe you could move back in with me. Not permanently, just until you get back on your feet. I could help you find a nice apartment, maybe even help with the deposit. There it was. The assumption that I was still the helpless woman he discarded, still dependent on his charity and goodwill. He had no idea that I owned a house, that I had financial independence, that I'd built a life that was fuller and more satisfying than anything I'd had when I was trying to earn his approval. That's very generous, I said carefully. But I'm not staying with Nora anymore. Oh. He looked confused. Did you find a place? I could still help with rent or whatever you need. I bought a house. Evan, I own it outright. The shock on his face was almost comical. You bought a house. How? With what money? I told him about my father's trust, about the inheritance I'd never known existed, about the lawyers and the real estate purchases and the monthly distributions that made me financially independent. With each detail, Evan's expression shifted from shock to something approaching panic. $400,000, he repeated when I finished. You've had access to $400,000 this whole time. I had access to it the moment I decided to learn about my father's estate. Which I did after you made me homeless, Mum. If I had known, what? You would have treated me differently. You would have been kinder to a woman with money than you were to a woman who'd given you everything. Evan had the grace to look ashamed. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, whether you're willing to admit it or not. We sat in silence for several minutes. I could see Evan processing this new information, recalculating his assumptions about my situation and his own leverage in our relationship. The son who had expected to find a grateful, dependent mother instead found a woman who no longer needed anything he had to offer. Where is the house? He asked finally. Pine Street, the Henderson place, after it was renovated, the blue house, with the white porch that sold for almost $300,000. To 85, I paid cash. Evan stared at me like I was a stranger. You're not the same person. No, I said, I'm not. I'm the person I might have been all along if I hadn't spent my entire adult life defining myself through taking care of other people, including me, especially you. Another long silence. When Evan spoke again, his voice was small, almost childlike. Does this mean there's no chance for us? No way to fix what I broke? I studied my son's face, seeing the boy I'd raised alongside the man who had betrayed me. The love was still there. It probably always would be, but it was different. Now, tempered by hard-won wisdom and self-respect, I don't know, I said honestly. Rebuilding trust takes time, and it takes consistent action, not just words. You'd have to prove that you see me as a person worthy of respect, not just a resource to be managed or discarded based on your convenience. How do I do that? That's not my job to figure out. Evan, you're the one who broke this relationship. You're the one who has to decide if it's worth the work to repair it. I finished my coffee and gathered my purse. I should go. I have book club tonight. Book club. And watercolor painting classes on Thursdays. And I volunteer at the elementary school on Tuesdays. I have a life now, Evan, a full life that belongs to me. I stood to leave, then paused. If you're serious about making amends, you know where to find me. But understand that any relationship we have going forward will be on equal terms. I'm not interested in being your project or your obligation. As I walked toward the door, Evan called after me, "Mum?" I really am sorry. I turned back to look at him. This man I'd raised and loved and lost and might someday forgive. I know you. The question is whether you're sorry enough to become someone worth forgiving. Outside the cafe, I walked slowly toward my car, feeling lighter with each step. The confrontation I'd dreaded for months was over, and I'd emerged intact, unchanged by his apologies or his needs. Whatever happened next between Evan and me would be my choice, made from a position of strength rather than desperation. For the first time since his phone call yesterday, I felt genuinely excited about going home to my house, my life, my carefully cultivated independence. I had book club to prepare for, and Martha Henderson's garden to plan for spring. I had a future that belonged entirely to me, and that felt like victory enough. Spring arrived early that year, and I spent most of April preparing my garden with the kind of focused attention I'd never been able to give to my own interests when my time belonged to everyone else. Bob Chen had been right about Martha Henderson's garden design. The raised beds caught the morning sun perfectly, and the soil was rich from decades of careful tending. I was planting tomato seedlings on a warm Saturday morning when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the hedge that separated my backyard from the street, I could see Evan's silver sedan parked behind my Honda. My stomach tightened slightly, but not with the old anxiety I used to feel when facing difficult conversations with him. Now, it was more like irritation at having my peaceful morning interrupted. He appeared around the corner of the house carrying a large cardboard box, looking uncertain about whether he was welcome in my backyard. I continued planting, letting him make the first move. "Hi, Mom," he said, setting the box down on my patio table. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by." I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. "I turn my phone off when I'm gardening," I said without looking up. "What can I do for you?" It had been 2 months since our coffee meeting, and Evan had made several attempts to reconnect since then. He'd sent flowers for my birthday, called weekly with awkward attempts at conversation, and even shown up at the community centre once. When I was volunteering, each gesture felt calculated, as if he were following some manual for repairing damaged relationships. "I brought you something," he said, gesturing toward the box. "I've been going through Dad's things, stuff that was still packed away in storage, and I found some items I thought you might want. This got my attention." I set down my trowel and walked over to the table, wiping my hands on the gardening apron. Nora had given me for Christmas. The box was labelled Henry, workshop in my own handwriting from when we'd packed up our belongings after his death. Inside were Henry's smaller tools, the ones that hadn't fit in the big red toolbox I kept in my basement workshop. His favourite hammer, with tape wrapped around the handle where his grip had worn the wood smooth. A small level he'd carried in his shirt pocket. The reading glasses he'd worn for detail work, still smudged with fingerprints from the last project he'd completed before his heart attack. At the bottom of the box was Henry's journal, a small leather notebook, where he'd recorded details of every repair job, every project, every small improvement he'd made to other people's homes during 40 years as a mechanic and handyman. His careful handwriting documented a lifetime of honest work and fair dealing. "I thought you should have these," Evan said quietly. "I know how much Dad's tools mean to you." I picked up Henry's journal and flipped through pages that chronicled a life of service to his community. "Why now?" "You've had these for almost a year." Evan shifted uncomfortably. "I was going through everything before the estate sale. The divorce is final next week, and I'm selling the house. I'm moving back to Portland, starting over, I repeated. "That seems to be a theme in your life lately. Mom, please. I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But I'm trying to make things right. I'm trying to be the son Dad would have wanted me to be." I closed Henry's journal and looked directly at Evan. In the bright spring sunlight, I could see how much the past year had changed him. The confident real estate agent who had dismissed me so casually was gone, replaced by someone who looked uncertain and diminished. "What does that look like to you?" I asked. "Being the son your father would have wanted. Taking care of you," he said immediately. "Making sure you're okay, that you have what you need." "I don't need taking care of, Evan. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own life. I know that now," he said. "But I want to be part of your life. I want us to be a family again." "We were never really a family," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "We were a mother and son where the mother did all the giving and the son did all the taking." "That's not family, that's dependency." Evan looked stricken. "That's not how I saw it." "Of course it wasn't. You were getting everything you wanted. Why would you question the arrangement?" I walked back to my garden and resumed planting, trying to work off the frustration that was building in my chest. Evan followed, hovering at the edge of the raised bed like a child hoping for permission to help. "What can I do?" he asked finally. "What would it take for you to forgive me?" I sat back on my heels and studied his face. This was the question I'd been asking myself for months, ever since our coffee meeting when he tried to apologize. The old Lauren would have forgiven him immediately, grateful for any sign of regret or desire to reconnect. But forgiveness wasn't the same as trust, and trust had to be earned. "I want the money back," I said finally. "What money?" "The $50,000 from my life insurance policy that I gave you for the house. I want it back, with interest." Evan's face went pale. "Mum, I don't have that kind of money right now. The divorce settlement, the legal fees, the loss on the house sale. I'm barely breaking even." "Then you'll have to figure out a payment plan," I said calmly. $2,500 a month for 2 years should cover it. I can't afford that much. My new apartment in Portland, the cost of starting over, then it will take longer to pay back," I interrupted. "But that's my condition, Evan. You want to make amends. You want to prove you've changed. Pay me back the money you took advantage of." "I didn't take advantage. You manipulated a grieving widow into giving you her life insurance money, then threw her out when she became inconvenient. What would you call that?" Evan was quiet for a long time, staring at the ground. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with tears. "You're right. That's exactly what I did." "Yes, it is. If I agree to pay you back, will you give me another chance? Will you let me try to be the son you deserve?" I considered his question while I planted another tomato seedling, pressing the soil firmly around its roots. The plant was small now, vulnerable, but with proper care and attention, it would grow strong and productive. Relationships, I thought, might work the same way. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "But Evan, you need to understand that our relationship going forward won't be the same as it was before. I'm not the woman who lived to serve your needs. I have my own life now, my own interests, my own plans. If you want to be part of that life, you'll have to earn your place in it. How do I do that? I gestured around my garden, my house, the life I'd built for myself. By showing up consistently, not just when you need something. By asking about my interests instead of just talking about your problems. By treating me like an equal instead of a responsibility. And if I pay you back the money, then you'll have done the right thing. But money alone won't rebuild trust. That takes time and consistent behavior. Evan nodded slowly. I understand. And Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but will you keep the door open? Will you give me the chance to prove I can change? I looked at this man who was my son, who carried Henry's eyes and my stubborn streak, who had broken my heart and was now asking for the chance to heal it. The love was still there, buried under layers of hurt and disappointment, but still recognizably real. The door's open, I said. But you're the one who has to walk through it. After Evan left, I finished planting my garden and then sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea, processing our conversation. The box of Henry's tools sat on the table beside me, and I pulled out his journal again, reading through entries from the early years of our marriage. Repaired Mrs. Johnson's front steps today. One entry read, refused payment. She's been struggling since her husband died. Sometimes the work is its own reward. That was Henry, always believing that doing the right thing was more important than getting paid, that relationships mattered more than transactions. He would have been heartbroken by what had happened between Evan and me, but he also would have believed in the possibility of redemption. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Nora last week, when she'd asked if I was being too hard on Evan, to demanding in my conditions for reconciliation. He's your only child, she'd said. And he's trying to make amends. Maybe you should meet him halfway. I gave him 43 years of meeting him more than halfway, I'd replied. Now he can learn what it feels like to do the work for once. But sitting in my garden, surrounded by the new life I was nurturing from seeds and soil, I wondered if maybe there was room for both justice and mercy in my relationship with Evan. I could demand the money back. I deserved that, while still leaving space for him to prove he'd learned from his mistakes. My phone buzzed with a text from Aiden. Coffee tomorrow? I have some updates on your trust fund investments that I think you'll find interesting. I smiled and typed back, looking forward to it. A year ago, my life had been measured entirely by other people's needs and schedules. Now I had lawyers who treated me as an equal, friends who valued my company, and interests that belonged entirely to me. I had choices and resources and independence. Whether Evan became part of this new life was up to him. I'd given him the roadmap, consistent effort, financial accountability, genuine respect. If he chose to follow it, we might eventually rebuild something resembling a healthy relationship. If he didn't, I had a full and satisfying life waiting for me either way. For the first time since his surprise visit, I felt genuinely at peace with whatever came next. The garden would grow regardless of Evan's choices. The sun would continue to shine on my front porch, and I would keep building the life I'd always deserved to have. That was enough for now. More than enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late September, nearly 18 months after Evan had moved back to Portland. I'd been expecting it for weeks. Aiden had warned me that the final payment was coming due, but seeing my son's handwriting on the envelope still gave me a small flutter of emotion. Inside was a cashier's check for $2,847.50, the final payment on the money he owed me, along with a brief note. Mom, this completes the debt as we agreed. I hope it helps demonstrate that I'm serious about making things right between us. Love, Evan. I sat at my kitchen table, holding the check and thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 24 months of regular payments, sometimes as low as $500 when work was slow, sometimes larger when he'd gotten a good commission. Each payment had arrived with a brief note. No dramatic gestures or demands for gratitude, just steady acknowledgement of his obligation. The money itself had been almost irrelevant. My trust fund provided more than enough for my comfortable lifestyle, and I'd ended up donating most of Evan's payments to the community centre's scholarship fund. But the consistency of those payments, the follow-through on his commitment, had meant everything. My phone rang as I was putting the check in my desk drawer. Evan's number. "Did you get the payment?" he asked without preamble. "I did." "Thank you. It feels good to be done with that debt," he said. "Not just financially, but you know what I mean." "I do." There was a comfortable pause. Our conversations had evolved over the past 2 years from stilted apologies to genuine exchanges about our lives. Evan had started therapy after his divorce, was working with a smaller real estate agency that focused on helping first-time home buyers, rather than chasing high-end commissions, and it even started volunteering at a literacy program for adults. "So," he said, "I have some news I wanted to share with you. Good news, I hope." "I think so. I've been seeing someone. Her name is Carol. She's a teacher like you were, and she has a 12-year-old daughter named Sophie. It's been about 6 months now, and it's getting serious." I felt a complex mix of emotions. Happiness that Evan had found someone who made him happy, curiosity about this woman who had captured his attention, and perhaps a small protective worrying about my own place in his life. "Tell me about her," I said. "She teaches 5th grade in Beaverton. She's divorced, has been raising Sophie on her own for about 5 years. She's single quotes s double quotes." He paused, searching for words. "She's kind, Mom, really kind. She volunteers at animal shelters on weekends. She reads to her daughter every night, even though Sophie's probably too old for it. And she's never once made me feel like I need to be anyone other than who I am. She sounds wonderful." "She is. And Mom, I'd like you to meet her, both of them, actually. I know it's been complicated between US, and I know I don't have the right to ask for much, but I'd really like for the people I care about to know each other." The invitation was carefully worded, with no pressure or assumptions about my response. This was the new Evan, the one who had learned to ask, rather than demand, to respect boundaries rather than steamroll over them. "I'd like that too," I said. "When were you thinking?" "Next weekend. I could drive down on Saturday, maybe take you to lunch somewhere nice, nothing fancy or formal, just a chance to spend time together." "That sounds perfect." After we hung up, I walked through my house, taking inventory of how much my life had changed since that dark period when I'd been sleeping in my car. The walls held paintings I'd created in my watercolor classes, photographs from trips I'd taken with Nora to visit her sister in California, and a framed certificate from the elementary school recognizing my volunteer work with struggling readers. The third bedroom had become my craft room, filled with furniture refinishing projects and a quilting frame where I was working on a wall, hanging for the community center. The kitchen windowsill held herbs I'd grown from seed, and the backyard was a testament to 2 seasons of dedicated gardening, tomatoes heavy on the vine, late summer flowers blooming in carefully planned succession, fruit trees that had yielded their first small harvest. I'd become someone I barely recognized from the woman who had defined herself entirely through taking care of others. I had opinions about books that I discussed passionately at book club, preferences for how I spent my time that I didn't negotiate with anyone, and friendships that existed independent of family obligations. Most surprisingly, I discovered I was happy living alone, not lonely. I had more social connections now than I'd had in years, but content with my own company in a way I'd never experienced before. I could eat breakfast at 10 in the morning if I wanted to, could read until midnight without worrying about disturbing anyone, could decide on a whim to rearrange my living room furniture or paint an accent wall purple. The following Saturday, I dressed carefully for lunch with Evan, Carol, and Sophie. Not to impress them, but because I'd learned to take pleasure in small rituals of self-care that I'd neglected for decades. I wore the blue dress I'd bought for book club's author event, paired with the silver bracelet Nora had given me for my birthday. They arrived exactly on time, and I watched from my front window as Evan helped a girl with curly brown hair out of the back seat, while a woman with kind eyes and laugh lines gathered what looked like a small gift bag from the front seat. Sophie was shy at first, staying close to Carol while we made introductions in my living room. But when she noticed the watercolor painting I'd done of the view from my back porch, her reserve melted away. "Did you paint that?" she asked, moving closer to examine the careful brushstrokes I'd labored over for weeks. "I did. Do you like art?" "I love it," Sophie said enthusiastically. "I want to be an artist when I grow up. Well, an artist and a veterinarian and maybe a teacher like my mom," Carol laughed. "Sophie has big plans for her future. All good plans," I said. "And there's no reason she can't do all of those things if she wants to." Over lunch at the restaurant downtown, I watched Evan interact with Carol and Sophie. He was different than he'd been with Paige, more relaxed, more genuinely engaged. When Sophie spilled ranch dressing on her shirt, he didn't get embarrassed or frustrated. He simply handed her his napkin and made a joke about being a messy eater himself. Carol was exactly as Evan had described her, genuinely kind, with an easy laugh and the kind of patient attention that good teachers develop over years of working with children. She asked thoughtful questions about my volunteer work and my garden, listened attentively to my answers, and shared stories about her own students that had me laughing until my sides hurt. "Evan told us about your house," Carol said as we waited for dessert. "Sophie, and I would love to see your garden if you don't mind. I've been trying to convince my landlord to let me plant vegetables, but no luck so far. I'd love to show you," I said. "And Sophie, if you're interested, I have some art supplies in my craft room. Maybe you could paint something while the adults talk boring grown-up stuff." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Could I?" Back at my house, I set Sophie up at my craft table with watercolors and good paper, while Evan and Carol followed me through the garden. Carol asked intelligent questions about soil preparation and companion planting, and I found myself enjoying the chance to share what I'd learned over the seasons of trial and error. "This is incredible," Carol said, admiring the late-season tomatoes. "You've created something really beautiful here." "It's been therapeutic," I said. "There's something satisfying about nurturing things and watching them grow." Evan was quiet, but I could see him taking in the evidence of the life I'd built, the thriving garden, the comfortable house, the obvious contentment I'd found in my independence. When we went back inside to check on Sophie, we found her absorbed in painting a surprisingly sophisticated landscape. "She's talented," I told Carol quietly. "She is. I'm trying to find art classes for her, but between work and her other activities, it's been challenging." I teach an informal watercolor group here on Thursday afternoons, I said, surprising myself with the spontaneous offer. Just 3 other ladies from the community center, very relaxed. "Sophie would be welcome to join us if she's interested." Sophie looked up from her painting with excitement. "Could I, Mum, please?" Carol looked uncertain. "That's very generous. But we live 40 minutes away, and I wouldn't want to impose ... no imposition," I said firmly. "Evan could drive her down after school and pick her up after dinner." Assuming that works for everyone's schedule, I glanced at Evan, who was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper. "I'd be happy to," he said quietly. "If that's what Sophie wants, And if Mom's sure about the invitation, I'm sure, later, after they'd left with plans for Sophie to start coming to my Thursday art sessions, I cleaned up the paint supplies and thought about the afternoon. For the first time in over 2 years, spending time with Evan had felt natural, uncomplicated by the weight of our past conflicts. Carol and Sophie had changed him, or maybe they'd simply given him permission to be the person he'd always been. Capable of being, he was more thoughtful, more present, less concerned with appearances, and more focused on genuine connection. My phone buzzed with a text from Evan. Thank you for today. For welcoming Carol and Sophie for the art classes. For giving us a chance. It means more than you know. I typed back. They're lovely. You chose well this time. I learned from the best teacher I ever had. I smiled and set the phone aside. Outside my kitchen window, the sun was setting over my garden, painting everything in golden light. Tomorrow I would call Nora and tell her about the afternoon, about Sophie's artistic talent and Carol's infectious laugh and Evan's growing maturity. But tonight, I would sit on my front porch with a cup of tea and enjoy the satisfaction of a life well lived, a relationship slowly rebuilt, and a future that held room for both solitude and connection as I chose. I'd started over at 71 and discovered that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. The woman who had once slept in her car was now someone who could offer art lessons to a gifted child, who had rebuilt her relationship with her son on her own terms, who had created a home and a life that belonged entirely to her. It was, I thought, exactly the ending my father would have hoped for when he left me that trust fund all those years ago. Not just financial security, but the freedom to discover who I really was when no one else's needs came first. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I raised my teacup in a silent toast to Walter Franklin, to Henry Maddox, to all the people who had loved me enough to want me to be happy, and to myself for finally learning to want the same thing. The inheritance Evan didn't know existed had given me more than money. It had given me back myself, and that, I knew, was the most valuable gift of all. 2 years after I signed the papers to purchase the Henderson house, I woke up on a spring morning to the sound of wind chimes on the porch and bird song fluttering. In through the open window, there was a serenity to Pine Street that hadn't worn off, even after all this time. I lay there for a moment, breathing in the stillness, the way someone does when they know they've made it home. I no longer needed to remind myself that this place was mine. I no longer flinched when passing a mirror, expecting to see a version of myself that had been discarded. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone older, yes, but stronger, rooted, blooming. At 73, I had finally claimed a life that belonged to me alone. But even now, the past had a habit of knocking on my door. It came that day. Not metaphorically, but quite literally. There was a knock around 10 a.m. I was in the middle of repotting my begonias when I heard it. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the door, half expecting it to be Bob Chen with another garden tip or Nora with her infamous rhubarb muffins. Instead, it was Sophie, Evan's girlfriend's daughter, 12 years old when I met her too. Summers ago, 14 now, tall for her age, with long legs that seemed permanently on the verge of running and eyes full of cautious hope. She was holding a manila envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "Hi," she said. I blinked. "Sophie, my mom said you were home. Evan, my dad, asked me to bring this to you." That she called him dad was still new. Evan hadn't pushed it. Carol had been firm about that. Sophie would decide when, and if that title meant something. Apparently, it had started meaning something. I took the envelope and gestured for her to come inside. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to, and I realized that even now, my connection to Evan was still full of unspoken tensions. Even for Sophie. "You want lemonade?" I asked. "Or I can make tea. Lemonade's good." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Henry had built 40 years ago. I poured the lemonade and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Evan's handwriting, along with a photo. The photo made my breath catch in my throat. It was of me, Henry, and a 4-year-old Evan at a state fair. I remembered the day, the sunburn on my nose, the way Evan had cried when he dropped his corn dog, the exact way Henry had hoisted him on his shoulders just as the fireworks began. Where did he find this? I whispered. Sophie sipped her lemonade. He said he was going through old boxes and found it in an album. He wants you to have it. I turned to the letter next. Mom, I know I've said a lot of things over the past year and a half, but some things are better written down when the noise is quiet and there's no one around to interrupt. I've been trying to think of a moment when I became the kind of man who could put his mother out of her home. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was a slow erasure. A million tiny choices, each one barely noticeable, until suddenly I didn't recognize myself. When I made you leave, I thought I was doing what was best for my marriage, but the truth is, I was doing what was easiest for my ego. I didn't want to admit how much I needed you. And I didn't want anyone else to see how far I drifted from the kind of man Dad raised me to be. You were right not to let me come crawling back. And you were right to set conditions for our reconciliation. Paying you back every month wasn't a punishment, it was a privilege. It taught me about accountability, about earning trust instead of expecting it. Thank you for letting me try. Love. Evani stared at the letter, reading it again, slow this time. Not just for the words, but for what they meant. Not a plea, not manipulation. Just ownership. Sophie watched me silently. Then, without prompting, she said, he changed. You know. He really did. He's not the same guy from the stories you told me. I smiled. I can see that. He was scared, she added, of being like your dad. That stopped me. I looked at her, this girl who wasn't my granddaughter, not legally, not by blood, but still, somehow, mine in a way I couldn't explain. I think, I said carefully, we're all a little scared of becoming the worst version of who raised us. What matters is doing the work to become someone better. She nodded like she understood. As the months went on, Sophie started coming by on her own more often. At first, she'd help me in the garden, then she asked to learn how to sandwood. Before long, we were refinishing old chairs together in the basement workshop, Henry's tools in our hands, music from the 70s playing on the radio. Evan came too, sometimes. Not often, not without warning, always with the courtesy of a phone call. Always with something to contribute: fresh produce from the Saturday market, new herb seedlings, help lifting something heavy. He never came expecting forgiveness. He came with respect. One crisp fall afternoon, while I was pruning the apple trees, he stood beside me, watching the leaves fall. You know, he said, I always thought Dad was invincible. Like nothing could shake him, but I think you were the strong one. I didn't reply. Some things don't need words. He handed me the pruning shears and walked back inside. That Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner for the first time in years. The table was full. Nora, Bob, and Emmy Chen, some of the community centre volunteers, Evan and Carol, and Sophie. There was laughter, spiced cider, and the familiar ache of missing Henry's deep laugh echoing off the walls. I stood at the head of the table, looking around at these people who had become my family not just by blood, but by love and choice. And time. I never thought I'd say this, I told them, but being thrown out of my old life might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. Nora raised her glass, to starting over, to learning who we are. Evan added, to becoming who we want to be. Sophie said quietly, and we drank that night. After everyone had left and the house had grown quiet, I sat on the porch, in Henry's old chair, a blanket around my shoulders and a mug of tea in my hands. I thought about the journey, the betrayal, the inheritance, the independence, the slow, stubborn healing, the loss of illusion. The gaining of peace. The truth is, I hadn't just found a house. I'd found a self I never knew I'd buried beneath years of sacrifice. And while Evan had come back into my life, the story hadn't returned to its original shape. It had evolved. As had I. This was my life now. Not a chapter, not an interlude. The full story. And for the first time in 73 years, I was the one holding the pen. Up next we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.